in Revelation chapter 7, starting at verse 2. It says, "Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of God on their foreheads. 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel.'" So my question is, who is that? Who or what is this verse talking about?
Well, you've mentioned one of two passages where the 144,000 are mentioned in Revelation, but there is another passage, and we need to read it if
Okay.
we want to get complete data about them. The other passage, so you read the one in Revelation 7, the other one is in Revelation, well, actually, you need to read more than
Oh,
what you read from Revelation 7.
okay.
So in Revelation 7, John sees four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds. And then he sees another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God. And he called out with a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm the earth and sea, saying, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And then he goes through a list of 12 tribes, which is actually not identical to any of the lists of the 12 tribes in the Old Testament. It's a unique one. But he hears about 12,000 people from each of the 12 tribes. So the number 144,000 is 12,000. It's 12 times 12 times 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
But then you need to keep going because we need to read passages in context. And immediately after the listing of the 12,000 from each tribe, he says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" So that's the relevant passage from Revelation 7. Then there's another passage in Revelation 14 where John says this, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb." Oh, actually, need to read it in context. Got to back up.
Okay.
In Revelation 13, we meet the two very sinister figures, the beast from the sea and the beast from the land. And we're told that the beast from the sea has a number. And the very last verse in chapter 13 says, "This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So that's the famous number of the beast. Mm-hmm. Then John says, "Then I looked." So right after he sees the number, he's told us about the number of the beast, he says, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had the name of his who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing their harps, and they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. Those were groups that surrounded God's throne in heaven. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouths no lie was found, for they are blameless. So that's the data that we're given about the 144,000, both in chapter 7 and chapter 14. So we know a number of different things about them. In terms of who they are, there have been a lot of proposals made. I'll start off by giving you two proposals that I think we can demonstrate pretty readily that are false. The first one is the view of the Jehovah's Witness organization. They claim that the 144,000 are a literal group of 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses who will be given a heavenly destiny to rule with Christ from heaven for 1,000 years in the future. And these Jehovah's Witnesses have it revealed to them by God, as this is a form of private revelation, that they are among the 144,000, and they are referred to sometimes as the anointed class of Jehovah's Witnesses, and only they get to go to heaven. All the rest of the saved stay here on earth. So they get to be up in heaven with Jesus.
Oh.
Now, this is a problematic interpretation for multiple reasons. The principal reason, though, is it just is not grounded in the text. You'll notice that the only thing that the anointed class in Jehovah's Witness theology has in common with the 144,000 as they're described in Revelation is the number 144,000. Nothing else is literal. They're not literally from the 12 tribes of Israel. They are not literally all male virgins. They presumably, many of them have told a lie at some point in their life, so that is not literal, that they've never told, that no lie is found in their mouths. There's a whole bunch that is not interpreted literally, except for the number 144,000. That's the only thing the Jehovah's Witnesses take literally. And that's a problem. Now, Revelation is not always to be taken literally, but you could approach this text in one of two ways. You could say either all of the details are non-literal, or all of the details are literal. But it's hard to, it's not a consistent position to say, well, this one detail is literal, but everything else is not. There's also no basis in the text for saying God is going to privately reveal to people, or that they're Jehovah's Witnesses as opposed to Jews, because that's another thing they're not taken literally here. And so this is a very problematic interpretation. Another interpretation that is quite problematic is common in dispensational circles in evangelical Protestantism. According to dispensationalists, now they're not doing what the Jehovah's Witnesses do. They don't take just one detail and say that this one detail is literal. Instead, what dispensationalists tend to do is say it's all literal. So these are a group, according to dispensationalists, of exactly 144,000 Jews, from 12,000 from each of the Jewish tribes, and they are male virgins. They have not lied, and so forth, and they will be active with Christ. They will be active on earth during the tribulation period that is in our future. So in our future, but before the millennium, the future millennium that dispensationalists believe in. The problem with this, one of the major problems with this, is that the 144,000 are described in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14. And those chapters in Revelation are not plausibly interpreted as applying in the literal sense to our future. The reason is, or among the reasons are, that we're told both at the beginning of Revelation that it is to reveal what will happen soon, and we're also told at the end of Revelation that the book reveals what will happen soon. Now, soon is to be judged from the perspective of John's original audience, which was alive 2,000 years ago. And if you've got a big gulf of 2,000 years, that ain't soon.
Yeah.
You can try to, fidget around that, but the fact is that the book of Revelation clearly begins in the first century, because in chapters 2 and 3 we have the letters to the seven churches that existed in the first century, but then at the end of the book of Revelation clearly applies to the eternal order. So somehow we've got to, in Revelation, get from the first century to the eternal order. And we would thus expect that somewhere in the book of Revelation, we ought to encounter a long period of time that would let us bridge the gap between the first century and the future. Well, okay, we do. And it's in chapter 20. It's the millennium. And 1,000 is a symbolic number. It doesn't need to be taken literally. It's like when God in the Psalm says the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. He's not implying that there's 1,001st hill where he doesn't own the animals. He means all of the animals on all of the hills are mine, and that's symbolized by 1,000. Well, in the same way, most Christians throughout history have understood the revelation, have understood the millennium of 1,000 years to be a long period of time that bridges the beginning of Christian history with the bulk of church history, and then we get the future. So there is a long period of time in Revelation that we would be living in right now. That means that the material before chapter 20, including chapters 7 and 14, would apply to the beginning of Christian history, before the millennium arrives. And that means that the 144,000, whatever they are, should have existed in the beginning of Christian history, either in the first century or the first few centuries. Now, there are other proposals about who they are, but I'll tell you the one that I tend to prefer.
Okay.
You'll notice that I'll point out two things. The first one is a clue in Revelation 7. And in Revelation 7, we first hear about them before we even hear the number of the 144,000. We first hear about them when that angel from the sunrise says, and I'll get the exact quote here. He says, "Do not harm the earth or the seas or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God." Okay, we're then going to later find out that the servants of our God that get sealed are the 144,000. But if you just read the book in literary order, you come to our first identification of this group of people, and they are called the servants of our God. So, Psychelet, if you're reading a Christian book and it refers to a group known as the servants of our God, who's it probably talking about?
Christians.
Yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
And then we notice that after we have this enumeration of 12,000 from each tribe of Israel, by the way, is there any connection between the number 12 and the Christian community in the first century that you can think of, Psychelet? I mean, Israel had 12 patriarchs. Did Jesus maybe appoint anybody that kind of corresponds to 12 patriarchs?
I can think of one group, those apostles.
Yeah, the 12 apostles. Okay, so then we go through the listing of 12,000 from each tribe, and then we get to that verse I wanted us to read, where John says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" So this great multitude that no one can number, that's clearly the worldwide Christian community. So here in Revelation 7, we have the 144,000 identified first as the servants of our God, which John hears about, and then he turns, after he hears about the people who are sealed, he then turns and looks and sees an innumerable multitude. So the description of the 12,000 from each tribe is sandwiched between these two descriptions of the servants of our God and the innumerable multitude of Christians. Now, why is that significant? Well, if you go back to Revelation chapter 5, we find God before the throne in heaven, and he says, in the right hand of the one seated on the throne, that is God, he sees a scroll written within and on the back. So it's what's known as an epistholograph. It's a scroll with writing on both sides, sealed with 7 seals. And an angel says, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And nobody is found who's like that. And John starts to weep because no one is found worthy to open the scroll. But then one of the elders around the throne of God tells him, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. So John has just heard about the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So John might expect to see a lion, a conquering beast, a really violent animal. But instead, he says that, and after being told about the Lion of Judah, he looks and says, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain. So instead of a vicious predator, John sees an herbivore that has itself been killed.
Yeah.
And yet everybody recognizes that that the Lion of Judah and the lamb that has been slain are both Jesus Christ. So you have this violent imagery associated with Jesus, this conquering imagery that's then associated with Jesus's passive nature. The way he conquers is through the cross. So notice John first hears about this figure, then he sees the figure, and it's something surprising.
Yeah.
And that's what we have going on in Revelation 7. First, he hears about the 12,000 from each tribe of Israel. Then he looks and sees the innumerable multitude. And so a great many scholars, and I would be one of the people who support this position, have concluded that the 144,000 are, in fact, the innumerable multitude and the servants of our God in general, the same way that that Jesus Christ is both the lion that John hears about and the lamb that he sees.
Wow, Jimmy, thank you so much. I did not expect to get all that from you. Thank you very much for that. Jimmy Akin is our guest. We better take a break, and we will come right back with lots of questions. 2 lines open, 888-318-7884.
Catch Catholic Answers live anytime at Catholic.com.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
Check out EWTN's official YouTube channel. Just follow the link on our homepage at EWTN.com or go to YouTube.com/EWTN.
Watch EWTN's live shows or today's homily from the Daily Mass.
Click the upload button to see our most recent clips.
You can also find all of EWTN YouTube content by clicking the playlist button.
It's all on the official EWTN YouTube channel at YouTube.com/EWTN.
Visit today.
Jimmy Akin, our guest, and still 1 line open. So go ahead and get on that line if you've got a question for Jimmy, 888-318-7884. It being Friday, a new episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World dropped today. A new one drops each Friday. A new episode of the Jimmy Akin podcast drops each Monday. What do we get today, Jimmy?
Well, today we got a Bible mystery. Today I look at the Nephilim, who are mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 and also in Numbers chapter 13. And I talk about what they are. In particular, I look at the theories of Zecharia Sitchin, who claimed that they were aliens from the planet Nibiru, which I conclude is utterly without foundation. Instead, I go through evidence both from the biblical texts and from other ancient Near Eastern texts and show what the Nephilim were. And I also point to a pair of verses in the book of Jude whose significance I only realized recently, that I think makes the interpretation I offer of the Nephilim basically, and their fathers, the sons of God, basically certain.
Oh, very good. All right, check it out at mysterious.fm or wherever you get your podcasts, or at Jimmy Akin's channel on YouTube, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. All right, to the phones we go. Let's see. Who do we got? Ryan in Midland, Texas, starting us out today. Hey, welcome back, Ryan.
Thanks for taking my call, guys. Now, Jimmy, I actually have a very short two-part Bible question for you. Mm-hmm. Now, when St. Peter in the Synoptic Confession narrative says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," would it be a stretch or not to say that St. Peter was familiar with the two powers in heaven concept?
He may well have been. Certainly Jesus was familiar with the two powers in heaven concept. I should explain what that is for people who may not be aware. The two powers in heaven doctrine is a view that was around in early Judaism, including in Jesus's day, that looked at various texts in the Old Testament where you have a reference to an individual that is like God and is even referred to as God, but yet is somehow distinct from God, such as, for example, the angel of the Lord, who in various passages is identified as the angel of the Lord, which would suggest he's distinct from God, but in other passages seems to just speak as God, and it will say, "God said," even though it's the angel of the Lord. So there's a distinction from God, but there's also an identification with God. We see a similar thing happening in the book of Daniel when Jesus sees God in heaven on his throne, and then riding on a cloud comes one like a son of man. And this son of man figure, because he rides the clouds, that's something that God does, was also seen by some Jews as a divine figure in heaven who is nevertheless distinct somehow from God. And so, again, we have a distinction from God, but an identification with God. And so this is what the second figure is sometimes called the lesser Yahweh or the little Yahweh or the second Yahweh, distinct from the first main primary Yahweh. And Jesus himself quotes from the Daniel passage when he's in front of the high priest, where the high priest says, "If you're the Christ, tell us plainly." And Jesus says, "I am, and from now on you will see the Son of Man come in with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest recognizes he's claiming to be a divine figure, and that's what because it wasn't a crime to claim to be the Messiah. But the high priest does regard it as a crime for Jesus to claim to be a divine entity, and that's why he tears his clothes and says, "You've heard the blasphemy, why do we need any more witnesses?" So Jesus clearly is aware of the two powers in heaven concept. He even alludes to it in the Gospels, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to propose that Peter, as one of Jesus's disciples, also had exposure to this concept, although that is more speculative.
Okay, Ryan?
Sure. The second part is, would I be right or wrong in saying Mark and John were saving story space in their Gospels by not having a Matthew and Luke style short and long nativity narrative other than John's "and the Word was made flesh" statement?
Well, John is definitely saving space in his gospel by omitting things that the synoptic gospels mentioned. Mark's case is a little different, and we'll talk about that on the other side of the break.
Hang on, Ryan, because this is the hard break. We got to take it. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Two lines open, 888-318-7884. Right back with more on Catholic Answers Live. We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron.
Throughout history, some Catholics have been among the worst kind of villains, right? Or were they? In Cancelled, historian Steve Weidenkopf digs into the lives and controversies of some of these Catholics whose reputations have been blackened, often unfairly. He takes on the anti-Catholic versions of history and defends not only these figures, but the faith they represent. Order your copy of Cancelled today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore. A little bit of groovy music for you there. Jimmy Akin, our guest. On the line, Ryan in Midland, Texas, with a couple questions, and his second has to do with the Gospels of Mark and John. Did they save space by leaving out the infancy narratives that we find in Matthew and Luke?
Yeah, so John is aware of the Synoptic Gospels. At least he's aware of Mark, and there's a very good probability that he's aware of Luke. Some people also argue he was aware of Matthew, and I'm open to the idea he did. I just haven't yet seen evidence that would convince me of that. But John is clearly aware of the Synoptic tradition, at least of two of the Synoptic Gospels, maybe of all three, and he is interested in saving space in his own Gospel. He alludes to the need to do this towards the end of the gospel, where he says, I suppose, Jesus did many things, and if I wrote all of them, I suppose even the world wouldn't contain the books that could be written. So he's thinking about, what am I going to write about Jesus, and how much space do I have, and things like that. It's also clear that he omits the discussion about John the Baptist going to jail that we find in the Synoptics, because at one point after he introduces John the Baptist, he at another point just says, this was before John was put in prison. And he says nothing else about John going to prison. So if you didn't know the Synoptics, you wouldn't have any idea what he's talking about. So he clearly is aware of the traditions about John going to prison, and he's deliberately omitting them because he assumes you've read about them. You already know the Synoptic tradition. So I think it's reasonable to say that one, and thus that is a big part of why John's gospel is different than the Synoptics, is because he's deliberately omitting things that the Synoptics contain and that he knows have already been put on record, so he doesn't need to record them. So thus, I think it would be reasonable to propose in John's case that for example, the infancy narratives are not paralleled in John because of John needs to keep his work down to the size of a single scroll, and he wants to cover stuff that the other evangelists did not include, at least primarily stuff the others didn't include. When it comes to Mark, I wouldn't propose this. for two reasons. The first reason is Mark is the first gospel. I've tried other viewpoints, like Matthew is the first gospel, and I was compelled by the evidence. No, Mark is just first. And so, and if people want to know why I say that, they can call in and ask. But Mark is the first gospel, and so he's writing before Matthew and Luke, and that means he's not looking at Matthew and Luke and saying, okay, they both got infancy narratives, so I don't need to include one. Whatever Mark's reason for not including an infancy narrative, it's not that he was looking at the other gospels and trying to save space since they already recorded the infancy narratives. The second reason that I would say this isn't the case for Mark is I think that Mark is a different kind of literature than Matthew and Luke. There is, I think, a strong case that Mark is what was known in Greek as an example of hupomnemata, or to use the Latin term for the same genre, commentarii. What hupomnemata and commentarii were notes. They were not polished. They were not put in good literary order. They were sort of a quickie, here are a bunch of notes about some subject. And they were often meant to then be taken, including by someone else, and polished and put into good literary arrangement and supplemented and polished and published as finished works. So I think Mark is writing just an initial collection of what you could think of as research notes about Jesus. And it was meant to serve as a basis for later works that would refine it, which is exactly what Matthew and Luke did. They took Mark, they supplemented it, rearranged the order to make it better, polished the language, and published it as later works, which was one of the things people in the ancient world did with hupomnemata. So I think the reason that Mark doesn't have various features is because it's not meant to be a complete finished biography of Jesus. It's basically a collection of research notes.
There we go, Ryan. I hope that was helpful to you. I'm going to continue on, however, Ryan, because all the lines are full now. Todd is in Knoxville, Tennessee, listening on the Catholic Answers app. Todd, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. First of all, Si, I want to say I'm excited. I haven't gotten your book yet, but your book might be the most important in the Catholic Answers library.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's my name's on it, but it's Steve Dawson's ideas. Yeah. So I hope you will find it important and helpful.
Jimmy, my question is, how does the author of John know what Jesus prayed in chapter 17 in Jesus' discourse when he prays to God the Father? How does the author of John actually know what was said?
Well, he was there. One of the things that the author of John's Gospel makes clear is he's an eyewitness. He refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved, and he makes it clear that he was there at the Last Supper. He records an incident where when Jesus has predicted that one of the 12 is going to betray him, Peter nudges the beloved disciple and says, ask him who he means. And so the beloved disciple then relays the question to Jesus, and Jesus indicates he's talking about Judas. So the beloved disciple then reveals himself at the end of the gospel as the author of the gospel. So the end of the gospel says the beloved disciple who had lain with his head close to Jesus's chest was the author. That incident of him laying with his head close to the chest, because they basically ate laying down on their sides. They didn't sit on chairs like we do. That is at the Last Supper, and Jesus makes the high priestly prayer of John 17 after the Last Supper, and so we know that the beloved disciple was there. Now, that doesn't mean the beloved disciple is using like a courtroom transcript of Jesus's words. We have good evidence that he used the literary device of paraphrase to better bring out the message of Jesus. But in terms of the basics of this situation, the beloved disciple was right there. He was an eyewitness of these events.
Okay, Todd?
Yeah, okay, because it made it seem like it was a separate prayer, like he was off from them when he said it. I guess that's where my confusion came in.
Yeah, that wouldn't seem to be the case. If you look in John 17, and you back up just a little bit, and at the beginning, it says of John 17, it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, and if you then back up to the previous chapter, Jesus is talking to the disciples. He says, now do you believe? So he's talking to the disciples. And it says, then when he'd spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said the high priestly prayer. So the other disciples are right there when he gives that prayer.
I'm going to leave it there, Todd, because as I said, all the lines are full, as happens when Jimmy is here. And I'm going to head down to Austin, Texas, where Caesar is, waiting patiently. Thank you for waiting, Caesar. Go ahead with your question.
Hey, how's it going? I'll jump right into it.
Thank you.
Y'all have said that in Islam, they worship the same God that we do. And I can follow the reasoning, and I tend to agree. But by that same reasoning, couldn't we also say that Freemasons worship the same God that we do, the uncaused cause of the world, the universe, the creator, whom they call the grand architect of the universe? Now, in both cases, they acknowledge there's one creator of the universe who is, the uncaused cause, but we draw a line between Islam and Freemasonry. How is it that we say that Islam worships the same God as us? They reject the Trinity. It's not the same, but it's the one creator. But we say Freemasons don't.
Who says that?
They are basically. Do we? I was under the impression that we believe that Freemasons are basically worshiping the devil.
Well, some people may claim that, and some Freemasons may do that, but that does not seem to be the general pattern of activity in Masonic circles. The church does not have a teaching on this. What the church does have is a teaching that Muslims do worship the same God. At least they don't understand him fully correctly, but they are directing their prayers to creator@universe.com, so to speak. And God knows they're praying to him as the creator. Well, the church has documents indicating that Freemasonry, especially in its historic forms, is bad, and that it may be doing the work of the devil and stuff like that. But then you could say that about, all kinds of people who do bad stuff. The church does not have a teaching addressing whether Masons direct their prayers to God. And so we have to do the best we can philosophically to figure out the answer to that question. And I would say it's probably going to depend on which group of Masons you're talking about. Here in America, Masonry takes a different form than it does in various European contexts and in the Latin American context. But here in America, a lot of Freemasons just consider it a kind of self-improvement social club, and they even invite Catholics to join, and lots of Protestants are members of it, and they definitely understand the so-called grand architect of the universe as God. They would say, yeah, when I go to the lodge, we use the term grand architect of the universe, but I'm talking about the creator and I'm talking about God. And since they're Christian, they would say, I'm talking about the Christian God. So I would say, unless they're adding something to their understanding of God that would exclude the true creator, like when I talk to the grand architect of the universe, I'm talking to a God who is not the God of the Bible. then they're talking to a real entity, namely the one true God that exists for everybody, and God will know they're talking to him. They're just using the title Grand Architect of the Universe, which is not in and of itself a bad title, because God is grand and he's the architect of the universe. Now there also can be another problem, which is that the devil sometimes he can trick people into relating to him when they don't realize it. I mean, St. Paul says that the devil disguises himself as an angel of light. Well, the devil could try to disguise himself as God too. And so if someone were to show me Masonic rituals that imply that the grand architect of the universe is also the devil, we'd have to take account of this possibility as well. But again, it's going to depend on which Masons you're talking about, because they don't all use the same rituals. And for many Masons, they consciously identify the grand architect of the universe that they mention at the lodge as the same deity that they worship when they go to their, evangelical or fundamentalist church on Sunday.
You know what? I got to leave it there because we got to take a break. We'll come right back and continue. Jimmy Akin, our guest, 888-318-7884, our number.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley, the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend, a coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul? And that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Human beings are God's greatest masterpiece. Every person is made in the image and likeness of God. But every saint, that is, every person who accepts God's invitation, his upward call to make them holy. And so every story presents us with a unique masterpiece that God is writing.
The Journey Home, Monday night, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and television.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest. I started out saying it was Bible questions for Jimmy Akin, so we've had lots of Bible questions, and certainly Bible questions are welcome, but we've opened it up to ask me anything. If you've got a question, whoever you are, you're welcome to call 888-318-7884. Hannah is in Tennessee watching on YouTube, and I'm going to say Gallatin. I have not heard the name of the town before, Hannah. How did I do? Gallatin?
That's perfect. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you for your encouraging words, Hannah. All right, go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
All right, so this is just a Bible question, because I have 1,000 others, but
okay.
This is a Bible question. We're going to go with, I started Bible in a Year with Father Mike Schmidt, and something really caught me off guard with Genesis 9. It's about Shem, Japheth, and Ham, and pretty much he said that theologists believe that Ham actually slept with his own mother while Noah was drunk. And I had never put that 2 and 2 together. And it explained, Father Mike Schmitz explained it to be like in Leviticus, I think 18 maybe. But if that were the case, what do the two brothers represent when they said that they covered him up?
Okay, I'll answer the question as posed first, and then I'll back up to provide a little more context on the overall issue. So the question as posed was, what do Shem and Japheth represent if Ham it represents, if Ham's gossiping about seeing his father's nakedness means that Ham was gossiping about sleeping with his mother. Well, in order to have sex with someone. And so this presupposes the theory that you just mentioned, that that's what Ham was really doing. Okay, so in order to have sex, people typically get naked. And so Ham would have been au natural with Noah's wife. And since the text in Genesis says Ham and Japheth walked backwards and covered up their father's nakedness with a blanket, that would be what the text would represent them as doing. If the wife is the father's nakedness in this passage, then, well, they would have taken a blanket and walked backwards so they didn't see the nakedness and covered up their mother, or covered up Noah's wife. You always got to say that, because back in the ancient world, your father's wife was not always your mother. In any event, that's how I'd interpret the text if this interpretation is correct. But I got to warn you that this is not something I would assume is correct. It has been proposed that that when it talks about Noah's nakedness in this passage, that it is a euphemism for some kind of sexual act. But what that euphemism might be could be any number of things. Now, it's true that later in the Pentateuch, you do have a passage that lists various female relations, most notably a man's wife, as his nakedness. And it talks about, you're not allowed to see this, you're not allowed to sleep with your mother because it's your mother is your father's nakedness. So there is a passage that is like that, and some people have proposed the theory that it sounds like you heard about on this podcast, but that's not the only violation. There are other violations that are sexual violations that are also described as uncovering someone's nakedness. In fact, that's the language that's used in that passage. It's not seeing someone's nakedness, it's uncovering their nakedness. Another proposal that some have made regarding this passage, and I'm not sure if I'm going to figure out a delicate way to say this, but basically that Ham homosexually raped his father. And that's been another proposal that's been made. However, other scholars are not convinced by either of these. And nakedness was something that, broadly speaking, was considered shameful, and there's no need to resort to these sex act interpretations when you could just take the text at face value and say, yeah, he saw his father lying naked in his tent and he gossiped about it, and then Ham and Japheth walked backwards to cover up their father so he wouldn't be lying around naked in the tent for family members to see. And that's all that's going on in this passage. So you have a range of different views about what it was specifically that Ham did. It could have been a sexual violation that the text is being delicate about. It also could just be straightforward and mean exactly what it says. So I'm not at a point of saying, and I recently actually looked into this subject again, and the evidence to me doesn't seem to demand any single interpretation of this. So I think the passage can be taken multiple ways, including the straightforward way. And I wouldn't insist that anybody adopt any one of these views. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Can I ask one more quick question? And it was on here because we had just talked about the Nephilim, but as I'm reading the flood situation, it seems to be that he flooded the earth due to, the evil ways of the earth, meaning the Nephilim, were having, or the angels were having sex with the women, and then he had to flood the earth. So I don't know. It seems odd to me that I see the Nephilim again after the flood. So were they not all, like, was Noah's, or any of Noah's relatives Nephilim that were on the boat that have, like, passed on that generation? Because I thought they were all killed in the flood.
Yeah. Okay. So so first I need to sketch the view that you're entertaining here, which I actually think is the correct one. There have been people who have argued that, so we've got, in Genesis 6, we've got three groups of people: the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim. And the best reading of the text would suggest that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Also, the best evidence indicates that the Nephilim are giants. That's actually what the word Nephilim means in Aramaic, is giants. You sometimes hear it said to mean fallen ones or something like that, but it's not spelled the right way in Hebrew for that. This seems to be it seems to mean giants, which is confirmed in our other earliest sources. Now, many people have tried to argue that the sons of God in this passage are humans of one kind or another, but all of those theories are late, and all of our early documents, both Jewish and Christian, interpret the sons of God as angelic beings. And so, and I think the book of Jude in particular confirms that that's what's being talked about in this passage. You can check out the latest episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World for a discussion of that. So the view that you're interacting with proposes that angels mated with humans and they gave birth to giants. I think that is the correct interpretation of what the author of Genesis is envisioning. That's a separate question than how literally are we supposed to take this. But the specific thing you're asking about is, if the flood wipes everybody out, how do we get Nephilim on the earth later? And there is an answer to that Genesis itself actually gives us. First, though, I would mention that at least in later Jewish and Christian literature, it's not the mating with the women that brings about the flood. Instead, in addition to mating with the women, the sons of God also teach humans various problematic practices, like how to forge weapons and how to make makeup so women can seduce men, and how to do astrology and how to do magic and things like that. So the sons of God end up teaching men wicked skills that then cause mankind to become wicked, and that leads to the flood. Okay, how did the Nephilim get here after the flood? Genesis tells us when the sons of God went into the daughters of men. That's how they got there the first time, and that's how they got there after the flood. It was because the sons of God did the same thing after the flood that they did before the flood. Take a look at Genesis 6, read it again, and I think you'll see what I mean.
Hannah, thank you very much. It's nice to hear from you again. We hope you will continue to call. And we got to take a quick break. So if you're on the line, hang on the line. We're going to get to you when we come back. If you're not, there's two lines open. Perfect time to call. 888-318-7884. Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest, having fun on a Friday afternoon here. Maybe Friday evening where you are, or even a Saturday morning. But as I like to say, thanks for whatever time it is. Thanks for spending the time with us. The number here is 888-318-7884. Lots of Bible questions because I started off in that vein, but you can call and ask whatever you want. 888-318-7884. I didn't ask you, Jimmy, what dropped on Monday on the Jimmy Akin podcast. We get a new one each Monday. What do we get this week?
Well, I had an interaction with a Lutheran YouTuber and pastor named Jordan B. Cooper, and he recently on his channel released a short in which he presented an argument against praying to the saints on the grounds that it would make them almost omniscient.
Okay.
And there are just a truckload of problems with that claim. So I did an extensive exploration of the problems with Jordan's argument, and you can check that out. That episode is out right now at on the Jimmy Akin podcast, among other places at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. Coming out this Monday, I'm addressing a subject that is prominent in recent discussion. I'm going to be talking about racism and the fact that racism is evil. God loves all his children. Cosmetic differences do not matter.
All right. That'll be on Monday.
This coming
Columbus
Monday.
Day. Yeah, well, here in the U.S., Columbus Day. Check it out. You can get the Jimmy Akin podcast wherever you get your podcast, but do check out the Jimmy Akin YouTube channel where you can see the collection of all the things that Jimmy is producing over there. All right, back to the phones we go because every single line is full. We'll go to Twin Cities, Minnesota, where Phil is listening to EWTN on channel 130, Sirius XM satellite radio. Hi, Phil. Got a question for Jimmy?
Hi, fellas. My question is, I was listening to a podcaster earlier today, and he made a couple of interesting claims. This guy looks at the most ancient texts that are known to man, which supposedly precede the Bible. And he is claiming that he knows of texts that go back, I think, around 28 or 30,000 years, something like that. And he made two claims which really caught my attention, and therefore I need you guys. One, that Jesus learned from those old texts, because some of what the old texts say are said in the Bible. That's the first claim. The second claim was that in those ancient texts as well, there was another flood like Noah. So basically his claim was that the flood of Noah in the Old Testament is a copy of something that happened before. Those are my 2 points, fellas. I sure appreciate the time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's go through this a bit at a time. The first claim deals with how long writing has existed. Now, it's true, there are writings that we have that go back to before the Bible. Hebrew has only existed as a written language for about 3,000 years. One of the first pieces of Hebrew writing that we have, it's in a kind of Proto-Hebrew. It dates to around 1100 BC. So that's basically 3,000 years ago. And it's a calendar, incidentally, but that's like the first Hebrew writing that we've got. Writing itself does go back farther than that. And we do have texts that are older than 1100 BC. However, writing does not go back 28 or 30,000 years. That's just nonsense. No scholars of antiquity or the areas of linguistics that study ancient writing would buy that. That's just, if that's what he said, he was severely mistaken. Writing goes back about a little more than 5,000 years. If you want a firmer estimate, it's like 5,300 to 5,400 years is is about as far as it goes back. Maybe a little farther than that, but not much. The first writing systems that we have are early Egyptian hieroglyphics, and then a little bit older than that are early Babylonian cuneiform, which is kind of wedge writing where they pressed wedges onto clay tablets. And we do have writings from ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia that are that old, but nothing like 28 or 30,000 years. That's just wild fantasy, if that's what he said. In terms of the second two claims, he said that Jesus took things from these texts. Well, he couldn't have taken them from texts that are 28 or 30,000 years old, because there are no such texts. If he wants to claim that Jesus learned things in his human knowledge from extra biblical writings that are old, well, let's see the evidence. You know, what specific documents are you talking about? And why would you suppose that Jesus was aware of these documents? Now, Jesus, we know, was aware. We know he could read, because he is described as reading, for example, from the scroll of Isaiah in the Gospels. And he, I would imagine, read things other than just what's in the Old Testament. But if you want to claim that he was aware of and used information from older sources, you need to cough up the evidence. I need to know what documents are being claimed and why it's being claimed that Jesus was aware of them. I assume because he never quotes any documents that aren't in the Old Testament, I would assume it's based on some parallel that's not an exact quotation between a thought that Jesus expresses and a thought that's expressed in whatever text this individual is thinking of. But just because there's a parallel in thought doesn't mean that Jesus is aware of something or quoting something. There's such a thing as parallel invention that happens all the time in world history. So just because there's a parallel that someone might be able to say, you know, hey, Jesus mentions this concept. Oh, and this other text mentions this concept, doesn't mean that Jesus got it from this other text. In fact, it could even be the other way around. Maybe the other text got it from Jesus, or maybe they got it from some common source, or maybe they independently came up with the idea. That kind of thing happens all the time. So I can't go too much further not knowing what texts are under discussion in this claim, but that's what I'd have to say as a general matter. When it comes to Noah's flood, there are parallels to Noah's flood in other ancient Near Eastern texts, including ones earlier than the Bible. The idea that there was a massive flood is something that is found in multiple cultures in this part of the world, and we have records, we have different accounts of the flood from multiple different sources. In Greek literature, the man who survives the flood is named Deucalion. In some Mesopotamian literature, he's named Utnapishtim. He also goes by other names in other Mesopotamian literature. And there are parallels between particularly the Mesopotamian literature and the flood narrative in Genesis 6-9. Now, you'll notice I just mentioned Genesis 6, the beginning of the flood narrative. Cy Kellett, have we had any recent discussions of Genesis 6 here on Catholic Answers Live, like maybe today?
About the Nephilim?
Oh, the Nephilim, no. Yeah.
So
here's the deal. The way that the Babylonians understood things, they had a group of deities who came down and mated with human women and taught humans a bunch of skills that became the basis of Babylonian and other Mesopotamian civilizations. So the skills that were taught by these heavenly beings were what made Mesopotamian civilization great. Okay? And also, there was a flood. And according to the Mesopotamian, various Mesopotamian accounts of the flood, the reason it happened was not because mankind had done something that offended God or the gods. Instead, humans multiplied to such an extent that they were making so much noise that it was keeping the gods awake at night. And the gods had now had insomnia, they were sleep deprived, they were really getting really cranky, and so the gods decide, we're just going to send a great flood and wipe out all those humans so they won't make noise anymore, so we can finally get some sleep. And they then unleashed the flood on mankind, but they didn't even know what they were doing. They hadn't reckoned with how powerful the flood was going to be. And even the gods were terrified of the flood when it came. And they were, according to some Mesopotamian texts, they were howling like terrified dogs at the oncoming of the flood. And so they unleashed the flood and it got way out of control. But fortunately, one human being, namely Utnapishtim, got advanced warning, like Noah did, and was able to survive the flood. Okay, so that's a Mesopotamian flood account. The heavenly beings come down, mate with the daughters of men, and teach them skills that make civilization in Mesopotamia great. They're the good guys. But humans are making so much noise that the petulant, petty gods decide to wipe them all out with the flood. And even then, they botch it and they endanger themselves with the flood. Okay, what the author of Genesis is doing, and this is particularly the case in the primordial history in Genesis, between Genesis 1 and 11, is he's debunking these various pagan accounts. Once you study ancient Near Eastern literature, it's really clear that's what he's doing. He's providing a sound monotheistic alternative to what's described in the pagan accounts. And you see that right from chapter 1 of Genesis. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, Cy Kellett, but when we get to day 4 of the creation week, what does it say God created on that day? Do you happen to remember?
I believe, is it both the sun and the moon?
Yeah, but what does he say? He doesn't use the term sun and moon.
Oh, that's right. He places lanterns.
Lights.
Lights, yeah.
2 great lights, one to rule the day and one to rule the night, and he also made the stars. Well, why would he not use the perfectly common terms sun and moon? The answer is because they were the names of the sun god and the moon god. And so if he had just said God made the sun and God made the moon, that could be misunderstood by his readers as the high God created the sun god and the high God created the moon god. But the author of Genesis 1 is a monotheist. He does not want his audience thinking that there are other deities. And so what he's doing is, now there were lots of pagan myths where a high god did create the other gods. What he's doing is he's debunking that by getting rid of the names and just calling them lights, which you could also translate lanterns, and the word can mean the same thing. But by just calling them lights, he's sending the message, they're just lights, they're not gods, don't worship them. Mm-hmm. Well, something similar is happening with the flood narrative. With the flood narrative, he indicates that it's angelic beings that mated with humans, not truly divine beings, and they didn't teach mankind beneficial skills. They taught mankind wicked skills. And it wasn't humans were making too much noise and the gods got a bug up their nose about it and decided to send the flood. Mankind became corrupted. It became wicked. And that's why a righteous and just God would send the flood. It's not because God's petulant or can't get sleep at night because of humans. It's because mankind messed up. And God was totally in control of the flood. He didn't unleash this force that he couldn't control. He determined when the waters rose. He determined when the waters fell. This is all under God's control, and as an act of mercy, God saved the righteous man Noah and his family from among all this. So yeah, there are parallels between the flood narrative in Genesis and other ancient Near Eastern literature, but what the author of Genesis is doing is debunking these pagan accounts and explaining things in terms of a monotheistic worldview that understands the righteousness of God and the sinfulness of man.
Got to leave it there. Got to take a break. Thanks, Phil. Right back with more Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church. On the web at magnificat.com.
Carry the faith wherever you go. Watch your favorite EWTN show, series, or special, or listen to your favorite EWTN radio program at any time, day or night. EWTN On Demand brings all your favorites instantly. Download the EWTN app at EWTNapps.com today.
Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live today, and lots of folks on the line, so I'd like to just keep moving when we have so many people on the line for Jimmy. And now we'll go to Nashville, Tennessee, where Joseph is watching on YouTube. Joseph, thanks for waiting so long, Joseph. Yeah, I know you've waited quite a while. Go ahead with your question.
Hey, thank you. Hi, Jimmy. My question is, what, I guess, is there such thing in like the modern day as like a true like liberal theology? Because most of the time when we speak about like a liberal Catholic theologian, it's almost like we're saying like that person is trying to use scripture to justify their political ends. But surely there are, I hope, right, good, solid, liberal, and not in the political sense, but, you know, more in the philosophical sense, theologians who are completely aligned with church teaching. They're committed to, you know, teaching orthodox beliefs and living those out, but they want to continue to develop church teaching to, you know, reach new generations of people. So I'm just looking as a conservative myself to, I guess, steelman that side of the church, because I care a lot about unity, and I think it's important that we don't get these things wrong.
Yeah. So, well, one thing that the terms liberal and conservative, as many churchmen like cardinals and stuff have pointed out, are terms that developed in the political sphere, and many have said it's not really appropriate to apply that terminology to people within the church in regard to their theological beliefs. Now, there may be and are Catholics who are politically conservative and Catholics who are politically liberal, but that's politics. That's not theology. And the church itself does not use the language of liberal and conservative when it comes to theology. It has a different way of talking about how people fall on into categories in terms of their theology. Broadly speaking, Catholics are either orthodox or unorthodox, and that can be understood in more than one way. Because there's more than one way you can judge orthodoxy. One way of judging orthodoxy would be to say, if a person disagrees or doubts or, you know, doesn't agree to a Catholic teaching, then they're unorthodox. But that's not I would say that's not the best articulation of what it means to be Orthodox as a Catholic, because the Church acknowledges that there are non-infallible teachings that that one can legitimately find oneself in a position where you don't feel you can assent to it. And the Church even has a document. It came out in 1990. It's called Donum Veritatis, which is Latin for the gift of truth. And it talks about how there can be situations where a theologian, after studying the matter carefully, may still find himself in a position where he just can't agree with a non-infallible teaching, which could hypothetically be wrong, because if it's non-infallible, the Holy Spirit hasn't guaranteed that it's true. And the document even acknowledges there have been cases where a teaching that was articulated in a non-infallible way was not free from all deficiency. And so I don't think using all church teachings as a criterion of orthodoxy is the way to go. I would tend to say that at least a better, I'm not saying it's the only other way to do it, but a better way to do it would be to focus on, does the person agree with the church's infallible teachings? Because if a person agrees with the infallible teachings, have been guaranteed by the Holy Spirit to be true. And so if you disagree with an infallible teaching, then I would say you're definitely unorthodox. You're definitely not in the sphere of Catholic orthodoxy. Now, I could imagine some intermediate states where, like, if you treat all non-infallible teachings as just optional, well, that would be a really big problem. And at some point you might cross a threshold where I would say, okay, this person is not being orthodox. But merely disagreeing with one or two or a small number of non-infallible teachings would not be something that would mean automatic lack of orthodoxy. And so if you think about it in that way, yeah, there are people who are concerned with doctrinal development, who are not simply repeating older theologies from previous centuries, but trying to take what's good from older theologies and but also take a fresh look at such things. And some of these have been honored with the title cardinal by popes, specifically because of their theological contributions. And so there are people who otherwise might be described as liberal, who are orthodox theologically and are trying to take a fresh approach that nevertheless incorporates good material from the past, but does not just slavishly repeat good material from the past. So I think the basic answer to your question, if I understand it correctly, is yes, there are such people.
Okay, thank you.
All right, very good.
By the way, Joseph, if you'd like more background on church teaching and all this, I'd suggest getting a copy of my book, Teaching with Authority. And since Joseph is in Nashville, Cy, why don't we send him a copy of Teaching with Authority?
Hang on, Joseph. All you have to do is, I put you on hold. John's going to pick up, and you give us an address, and we will send you Teaching with Authority. Thank you very much for the call. Going over to Oklahoma now, where John is listening to EWTN on Channel 130, Sirius XM satellite radio. Welcome, John. Go ahead with your question.
Okay, well, it's an honor to speak to Jimmy Akin. I don't usually call in when you're on because it's so hard to get on.
You did it today.
The honor is all mine.
Now, this is a two-part question. One, I've heard, yes and no to this question of when Christ died, the veil was torn, and that represented the fulfillment of the covenant. At that point, did the Jewish people cease to be God's chosen ones? And the second part of that is, after Christ's death, is there anything in Jewish writings that mention the death of Christ, and maybe they had you can't really say buyer's remorse, but, remorse in what they did to him?
Okay. So we're about to hit the hard break, so I'm going to need to continue this on the other side. But let's at least see if we can get started. The first question was, first of all, you mentioned a particular interpretation of the tearing of the temple veil. I would issue a word of caution here, because the tearing of the temple veil can be understood in multiple different ways. And many people just assume it means a single thing, and it actually can mean multiple different things. So just some caution on that point. We don't want to prematurely exclude any possibilities about what it might mean. Having said that, when we come back, I'll talk about, did the Jewish people stop being God's chosen people?
We'll do that right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Have you ever wondered about the mysterious, even obscure aspects of the Catholic faith? Dive into the Jimmy Akin podcast, where Jimmy brings together information from many fields as he pushes the boundaries of apologetics. Tune in today to the Jimmy Akin podcast, Mysteries of the Faith, a highly entertaining, informative, and at times humorous show that will help you grow in your faith. Visit JimmyAkinPodcast.com today to subscribe.
Lots of people have big questions about Catholicism. It needs a big book of answers, and now it's got one. The Big Book of Catholic Answers is filled with helpful replies to more than 250 questions about the faith. Questions about God, salvation history, the Creed, the Bible, the list goes on and on. Order your copy of the Big Book of Catholic Answers today at shop.catholic.com, or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun. And that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron. Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest. And this weekend only, get your copy of Jimmy Akin's runaway bestseller, The Bible is a Catholic Book, for just 10 smackers, $10, 10 simoleons, plus free shipping anywhere in the United States. And that's not cumulative. It's just 10. Get yours today by going to shop.catholic.com. The sale ends midnight Honolulu time on Sunday night. Jimmy Akin's book, The Bible is a Catholic Book, on sale at shop.catholic.com for just $10 with free shipping at shop.catholic.com. John's in Oklahoma and wanted to know, did the Jewish people stop being the chosen people?
Okay, so the answer is not according to St. Paul. Now, there have been people who have proposed this idea. It's sometimes called supersessionism, but it's really hard to reconcile this with what St. Paul says, particularly in the book of Romans. And this is actually multiple places in the book of Romans. For example, in Romans 2, St. Paul is talking about God's judgment and on both the righteous and the wicked. And he says that there will be so this is Romans 2:9, there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil. Now, before I go further, Psychelet, when Paul says there will be tribulation and distress for the wicked, is he talking about the present, or is he talking about the future?
I'm so good with my tenses, Jimmy. That's got to be the future.
Yeah, he is talking about the future. He's talking about Judgment Day here. But I didn't finish the sentence, because what he said was there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But there will be glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. So now, we could debate, what does first mean? Is that chronological first, or does that mean, is it some other kind of first? But notice Paul is drawing a distinction between Jews and Gentiles and indicating that they have different statuses on Judgment Day. The wicked Jews are going to get punished first, whatever first means, and the righteous Jews are going to get rewarded first, whatever first means. So does that sound to you like the idea the Jews have lost their special place with God, Psychelet?
It does not.
Yeah. Now let's forward to Romans 9, where St. Paul talks about how the Jewish people they have various benefits, the highest of which is of their people is the Christ. And he says that God has not rejected them, but that they are beloved on account of their forefathers. So if the Jewish people are still at the time that Romans is written, Psychelet, is that before or after the crucifixion?
Well, I was going to say way after, but after.
Yeah, 20, about 22 years after, around AD 55. So after the crucifixion, the Jewish people, St. Paul indicates, are still beloved on account of their forefathers in a way that distinguishes them from Gentiles who don't have similar forefathers. So once again, it's really hard. And he also says God has not rejected them. And he says the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. So with all that, it's hard to say that they've lost their status as God's chosen people. Then when we fast forward a little bit further in Romans, he talks about how that there will be some kind of large-scale conversion of the Jewish people to God and Christ, and that will be one of the signs of the end of the age. That he says if their rejection meant life for the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So he sees this future Jewish conversion, large-scale Jewish conversion, as signaling the end of the world. Well, once again, other people don't have that happening. This is something distinct for the Jewish people. So we see in multiple different ways that the Jewish people still have a unique role in God's plan, and thus that distinguishes them from any Gentile people. And we can thus say they have not lost their status as the chosen people. What has happened is, in addition to the Jewish nation, God has also built up a new people for himself of Christians who are also God's chosen people. But that doesn't mean that the Jews have lost status as God's chosen people. It's just now they got some company. Okay. That's what I'd have to say about that. But John, from Where the Wind Comes Sweeping Off the Plain, I believe had another question.
Yes, John?
I did. Now, after the death of Christ, is there anything in Jewish writings where they speak of his death and maybe have remorse for what they did?
Well, there are. We got to kind of define what we're talking about, because it's been 2,000 years since Christ's death, and there have been a lot of Jews with a lot of different opinions in 2,000 years, and many of them actually became Christian. In fact, even though their Jewish leaders tended not to become Christian, I've read historians like Ramsey McMullen who argued that the mission to the Jews actually largely succeeded in the ancient world, that lots of them did become Christian. And they obviously wouldn't approve of their leaders having killed Jesus. But if you're talking about like the rabbis that went on to lead rabbinic Judaism, Jesus's death is mentioned in some Jewish writings like the Mishnah and the Talmud. And we actually can reconstruct what the actual charges against Jesus were. And it's a fascinating discussion. But basically, he was accused of enticing people into idolatry. That's a reference to his claiming to be the divine Son of God, the second power in heaven, and of using magic. Which was a standard charge. If someone was doing miracles and you didn't like their miracles, you just said, it's all sorcery. And that confirms that Jesus had a reputation as a miracle worker. And we can show, based on a careful historical analysis, that these likely were the charges that were used against Jesus. So we seem to have confirmation from Jewish sources of material that's reflected in the New Testament itself, like when he claims to be the divine Son of God before the high priest at his trial. In terms of do the authors of the Mishnah and the Talmud express regret as a group? Heck no. There was significant antagonism between the Jewish community and the Christian community, and so they do not, as a group, display regret over this. But that doesn't mean that all Jewish leaders in rabbinic Judaism had a negative attitude towards Christians. I forget who it is. I forget its name. Well, okay, one whose name I do remember is Gamaliel, who stood up for Christians in the book of Acts even. And Gamaliel was a Jewish leader a little bit before the time of rabbinic Judaism, but he was still a Jewish leader after the crucifixion, and he stood up for Christians. There also are figures described in either the Mishnah or the Talmuds that also had at least a somewhat positive attitude towards Christians. One was and I forget what medical condition he had, but he had a medical condition and he was dying, and he asked someone to heal him in the name of Jesus. And they said, but we can't heal you in that name. And he said, yes, you can. And he was about to cite a verse to prove that he could be healed in the name of Jesus, but he then died before he could cite the verse. But that would indicate, if this story is true, that would indicate he had at least, he may not have been a Christian, but he had a positive attitude towards Christians and Jesus, and that would seem to express, something other than vehement approval of the crucifixion. And of course, there have been many later Jews, including Jews who were like rabbis today, that have positive views of Jesus. In fact, there is a 20th century rabbi named Pinchas Lapid who was so positive that on Jesus that he actually argued Jesus did rise from the dead, and he is the Messiah for the Gentiles, and he may be the Messiah for the Jews when he gets back. So, even though he remained an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, he definitely had a positive attitude towards Christians and towards Jesus Christ.
John, I got to leave it there because it is now time for the break. We will be right back with more questions for Jimmy on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
The Catechism defines evangelization as the proclamation of Christ and his gospel by word and the testimony of life. But what does that look like in real life? It looks like St. Paul street evangelists out in the public square sharing the good news. We're a Catholic nonprofit that starts conversations by handing out free sacramentals. Then we employ our method of listen, befriend, proclaim, and invite. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to learn more.
One of the reasons we should go to Mass is because it is the food of the saints that we receive. And for the saints, they understood rightly that the time after Holy Communion, that those moments are the most precious moments of our lives.
The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, live from the EWTN Chapel, every morning, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and Television.
It's been an interesting variety of questions today. Thanks, everybody who has called. We'll try to get to as many as we can before we have to go. Jimmy Akin, our guest. And off to Gainesville, Texas. We go. Watching on Facebook, James in Gainesville. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much. Great to be on.
Glad to have
I had
you.
a question about Marcionism. I know that it was, I guess he thought that there was a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. Did he completely reject the Old Testament and its teachings, or how did that go about? And did he have a very big following with his thoughts on this?
Well, okay, so Marcion of Sinope was, for people who may not be familiar, he was a Christian. He was an early Christian heretic. He was born in the late 1st century. He died around the middle of the 2nd century, and he had gone from his home in what's now Turkey to Rome. And he was a wealthy man, and he tried to promote his ideas, but they did not go down with the Christian church in Rome. He got kicked out, and so he founded his own church, which for a time was pretty sizable. It wasn't as big as the Christian church, but it was still pretty sizable. He did have a system that is often described as ditheistic, meaning he believed in two gods. One was the God of the Old Testament, one was the God of the New Testament. He used a term that some of the Greek philosophers had also used for a major godly figure to refer to the God of the Old Testament. That word was demiurgos, or demiurge, to give it its English form. Demiurgos in Greek means craftsman. So various Greek philosophers would talk about the craftsman of the universe, kind of like the grand architect of the universe. But Marcion appropriated that term and applied it to the God of the Old Testament. Basically, what he did was, and he did reject the Old Testament as a body. He also rejected significant chunks of the New Testament, including 3 of the 4 Gospels. He only kept the Gospel of Luke, and he even edited that. He also edited the writings of St. Paul, so he produced an abridged and expurgated version of the New Testament to try to purge it of Jewish ideas, because he recognized these Jewish ideas are in there and he couldn't have that. So that's kind of an overview. Is there more to your question, or have I covered the aspects of it you wanted covered, James?
You answered the second part, because I was going to ask if he is basically anti-Semitic, because I did see that he had edited the Gospel of Luke of anything to do with Jewish elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the concept of anti-Semitism is a modern concept, and so I hesitate to apply it to people in the ancient world because it's a modern category, and unless it's also very poorly defined, it can be used in multiple different ways. What I think is fair to say is Marcion did not like Jewish teaching.
James,
whether he held that against Jewish individuals is a separate question, and I'd have to document that with independent evidence. The mere fact someone didn't like Jewish religious ideas doesn't mean they hated Jews.
As I was going to say, James, I got to leave it there. I want to try to get as many on as I can with Jimmy. Terry is in Texas watching on YouTube. Terry, thank you for waiting so long. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Texas watching on YouTube.
Hang on. Terry, I think I may have pushed the wrong button. Terry, are you there with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I got you. That was me, Terry. I apologize for that. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Okay. In regards to marriage, Jesus says to Peter, what you bind on earth, you bind in heaven. So when the church binds people in marriage, why are they not bound in heaven?
Okay.
And then I have one other quick question for you after.
Okay. Well, let's deal with this one. So the phrase binding and loosing meant in early Judaism, and we know this from other sources outside the New Testament, it was an idiom that referred to making judicial rulings, like we're instituting a law, or we're abolishing a law, or we're excommunicating a person, or something like that. And when it says bound in heaven, now this is Matthew's language. Matthew avoids the word God a good bit. That's why when you read Mark and Luke, it'll talk about the kingdom of God, but you read the same passage in Matthew and he's changed it to kingdom of heaven, because the word God is so sacred that some Jewish individuals like Matthew, they didn't want to say God, so they would say heaven as a replacement for God. So when he says whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, what that means is whatever you bind on earth is going to be bound by God. God is going to back it up with divine authority. But that doesn't mean the effects of what you bind on earth will extend after this life off of the earth into heaven, because that's a different thing. If you're binding something or passing a law here on earth, well, that's where the law applies. It will be backed up by God as having divine authority, but that doesn't mean that it continues to affect people, like don't eat. Let's say the church had created a rule that says don't eat pork. Well, once you're dead, you're no longer subject to earthly law. You're with God in heaven, so you're not subject to earthly law anymore. And specifically in the case of marriage, Jesus himself said that that in the afterlife, we're going to be like the angels of heaven, neither marrying nor giving in marriage. So one thing we know for sure is not going to linger into the afterlife are marriage ties. So the basic explanation is what Jesus meant was you can make laws and judicial rulings here on earth and God's going to back them up, but that doesn't mean they're going to continue to bind us in the afterlife. And one thing we know for sure won't bind us in the afterlife are marriage ties, because Jesus told us they won't bind in the afterlife.
Mm-hmm. Okay, gotcha. Thank you so much. Can I ask from
real quick? Don't ask
yes.
If you can ask, just ask.
Okay. From a moral standpoint, if your Protestant friend wanted to get married at your home, would you be okay with that, with a pastor, or do you think no, because we know that we need to get married in the church?
Well, Catholics are obliged to observe Catholic marriage law, which ordinarily means getting married in a church, but Protestants are not bound by Catholic marriage law unless they're a former Catholic. So if your friend and her husband to be have never been Catholic, and they want to get married in your home or on a beach or in a hotel or any number of places, they're perfectly free to do that. And God will still honor the marriage. So I wouldn't have any problem with it. It's a bit of an unusual request, but there's no problem with it in terms of principle.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I didn't know if that was contributing to, not a good thing or whatever, if I allowed people to do that.
All right.
Yeah, no, they're not doing anything contrary to God's law.
Terry, thank you. I know you were very patient. Thanks for waiting and getting on with those questions. Andrew in Pennsylvania is next, watching on YouTube. Andrew, go ahead with your question.
Hey, Jimmy. I was just kind of wondering, with all the recent controversies and whatnot going on in the church, mostly amongst homosexuality, I was wondering, what does it necessarily mean in the Catholic understanding of things that, Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church?
Okay. The church doesn't have an official teaching, but I think that, as far as I'm aware, the church doesn't have an official teaching on what that phrase means, but I think it's quite clear if you study Scripture what it means. So the Greek word for hell here is not a reference to the place of the damned. It's Hades, or to translate it into modern English, Hades. Hades was just the place of the dead. Greek had other terms for the place of the damned, like Tartaros, but Tartaros is not used here. Neither is Gehenna. So this seems to be just a reference to the place of the dead. And when you look up parallels in the Old Testament to, like if you look in the Greek Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the Old Testament, and you look up gates of Hades, you find it mentioned, and it's a reference to death. So like you'll find statements like, I was sick and I was on the point of dying, and the gates of Hades closed against me, but then you saved me. And so the gates of Hades prevailing against a person is a reference to that person dying and going to the realm of the dead. So when Jesus says the gates of Hades will not prevail against his church, based on the use of the phrase in the Old Testament, it would mean his church is not going to die. So it's never going to pass out of existence.
That makes sense, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I just always heard the understanding of, I always kind of heard the interpretation that is where the seed for papal infallibility came from.
Well, that's not to say that papal infallibility isn't related to this, but it's more complicated than that. Since we're running short on time, Psychelet, why don't we send Andrew a copy of Teaching with Authority, and he can read more about it.
Andrew, if you'll do that, if you'll just give us an address, we'll do that, and I will get Rebecca on the line here. Rebecca, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question. No, Rebecca?
Hi, y'all. Thank you for taking my call.
Hi, Rebecca.
My question is about women cutting their hair, wearing makeup, things like that. Jimmy, I think I heard you say just a little while ago that the Nephilim brought, the tools of war and makeup to seduce and all that, and it's evil. So
yeah, I noticed that too, Rebecca.
So what's your question for me, Rebecca?
Well, if there's any church teaching, or are we allowed to cut our hair and wear makeup and, pretty clothes and that sort of thing? Yeah,
absolutely. You just want to keep it in. Yeah, absolutely. There's no church teaching against these things. So you're at liberty to do these things. Christian women don't have to never cut their hair, never shave their legs, and walk around wearing a potato sack. They can make themselves attractive and so forth. What you don't want to do is focus on externals so much that it causes problems in other ways, like, I'm going to get myself looking all sexy so I can go seduce a man I'm not married to. Okay, well, then you're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. There's nothing wrong with looking nice and cutting your hair and wearing makeup or jewelry or anything like that. Or another way would be, I'm gonna go buy a bunch of diamond rings and I'm not gonna feed my kids because I'm gonna spend all my money on my diamond rings. Well, that would be wrong too. But as long as you're not causing some kind of other problem, look nice, feel good about yourself, make yourself look nice, all that's totally fine. Church has no teachings against that.
Rebecca, thanks for bringing us right to the end of the show. Thank you for waiting and asking your questions.
Yeah. By the way, Cy-Kellett, notice what the women did with in like First Enoch with what the sons of God taught them was go seduce men they weren't married to.
Yeah, that's definitely frowned upon. Even I know that one, Jimmy. Thanks, Rebecca. Jimmy, thank you. I always enjoy the 2 hours. Thanks.
Likewise, my pleasure.
Check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, mysterious.fm. Check out the Jimmy Akin podcast, and you can find both of them anywhere you get a podcast, but also at Jimmy's YouTube page. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.